Hello, everyone, and welcome. We are so excited to have our November Department of Learning and Teaching Black Lives Matter Social Justice and Advocacy Series event today. Race is Political, Exploring the Untruth Behind We the People. We decided to do a session around voting because it is November, which is a traditional voting month. And we wanted to create some space for us all to come together and look at these issues through the Black Lives Matter lens. So thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Dr. Jez. And once again, good evening. And thank you so much for joining us tonight for our session on voting rights and why it's more than just a vote. To help us better engage in tonight's conversation, we would like for you to watch a brief clip about why we cannot take this right for granted. So as you watch this video, there are two things we would like for you to think and reflect on. Number one, how does knowing the past connect us to our future? And then two, how did we get here? So Mario, if you wouldn't mind starting the video clip.
Democrats in Congress are waging the fight of the century right now over our freedom to vote.
Never did I think that the cause for which our beloved colleague, Congressman John Lewis, and the foot soldiers, the cause for which they marched 56 years ago, the Voting Rights Act, would again require congressional action to restore its full protections. This reminds us that progress is elusive and every generation must fight and fight again.
Let's back up. What's this fight all about?
First, we have to look back in history to understand what we're up against today.
With a stroke of the pen, in 1965, President Lyndon Johnson made good on a promise that this country had failed to fulfill for more than a century. He signed the Bipartisan Voting Rights Act into law.
It ensured that millions of African Americans could finally cast a vote that counts.
By 1970, almost as many Black Americans were registered to vote in Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, Louisiana, North Carolina, and South Carolina as had been registered in the entire century before 1965.
For democracy to work for all of us, it must include us all.
That's why Black, Brown, Asian American, and Native American people with disabilities, language minority voters, and women of all races organized movements throughout history to secure the freedom to vote. And it is why there have always been a handful of extremist politicians who sought to take it away.
The Voting Rights Act has weathered many attacks over the decades. None was more devastating than the U.S. Supreme Court decision in Shelby County versus Holder in 2013.
Shelby County took away a core part of the VRA that gave the Justice Department the power to review any proposed voting changes in states with histories of voter discrimination against voters of color and Native American voters to ensure that these changes were not racially discriminatory. If these changes were, the federal government could block them from going into effect, ensuring that all voters, regardless of race or background, could cast a ballot free from discrimination. Chief Justice John Roberts, who wrote the majority opinion in Shelby County, tried to argue that our country no longer lived under the shadow of white supremacy. He was wrong. Within minutes of that decision, then Texas Attorney General Greg Abbott tweeted that the state's strict voter ID law should go into effect immediately. The following day, Alabama said it would finally start enforcing the restrictive anti-voter law it had passed 2 years earlier.
And weeks later, North Carolina Governor Pat McCrory signed a monster restrictive law that the Fourth Circuit later said targeted African Americans with almost surgical precision. The crisis has only worsened today.
As the Brennan Center for Justice found, lawmakers in 48 states have introduced more than 380 anti-voting bills this year. Democrats in Congress
Wow, 380 anti-voting bills this year. Thank you again for joining us this afternoon, evening, night, depending on where you're joining us from. We're delighted to have you with us. I'm going to quickly just share with you the agenda for where we're headed tonight or today, and then we'll get started with our panel. As most of you know, that if you've joined us before, this work began after the murder of George Floyd with the creation of a solidarity statement. So I will read part of that, and we will also direct you towards the website if you'd like to read the full solidarity statement. We're delighted to have a panel of three individuals who bring a lot of experience in history and different perspectives as it relates to voting rights and voter suppression. And so we'll have a guided panel discussion with those three individuals, and we'll introduce them and allow them to share briefly about themselves in just a moment. Then we will go into some breakout groups, and those will be facilitated to allow you to have a chance to really reflect upon what was brought up in the panel. Then we'll bring that back to the whole group, share some takeaways, and as we do with each of these sessions, we want to make sure that we provide you with resources that you can take back, utilize, share with others, and then we'll have some closing remarks by Dr. Quezada with the Department of Teaching and Learning at Seoul. So that's our agenda for today. I'm going to share briefly just a piece of our solidarity statement, and thank you, Raketa. You put the website in the chat, so if you haven't had a chance to read the full solidarity statement, please take some time to do that. So I'm just going to be reading just a brief section of that. We, as a social justice collective of educational leaders, are committed to uplifting and providing a better quality of life for our community. We are change agents. We are scholars and activists who are fighting against systemic and institutional racism, police brutality, and inequities in education. We believe that we cannot achieve justice regarding racial, educational, political, economic, climate, or any other form of injustice if it stifles a person's human rights. An injustice against one person is an injustice against all. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over, I think, to Michelle and Raketa, who will introduce our panel.
Absolutely. Thank you so very much, Tommy. So we have three wonderful panelists with us tonight. We have different perspectives, actually, from our different panelists. Casey Boland, who's a teacher in Texas, and we have Tembilla Covington, a community activist and also a pastor, and we have Dr. Casey Dominguez here with us that is with the University of San Diego. So we have three, not just three different perspectives, but also from three different states, as you heard, Texas, North Carolina for Tembilla Covington, and California for Dr. Dominguez. We do have on the next slide a little bit about their bio to give a little bit of context of who they are, a little bit more of who they are. And since you will all have, post the meeting, a link to the slide, you'll also be able to access their email if for whatever reason you do want to kind of reach out and keep the conversation going and communicate with them. So let's go ahead and actually get started with our questions. Again, thank you, panelists, for being here. Michelle, did you want to add anything?
Well, I would just want to once again thank you again, panelists, for being here. Just a little bit more on information about our panelists. Casey Boland is a high school history teacher at Lake Highlands High School in Dallas, Texas. She has spent the last 24 years in education, where she has taught AP US History and Economics. And this year, Casey is teaching the inaugural African American Studies class. For Ms. Tembilla Covington, as Raketa stated, she is a community activist and minister whose work focuses on intersections of faith, social justice, and action. In addition to being the founding pastor of Crossing the Red Seas Ministry, Tembilla works as a strengthening neighborhoods and families program director for Neighbors for Better Neighborhoods, a nonprofit organization in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, that focuses on civic engagement, equitable development, and economic mobility. And last but not least, Dr. Casey Dominguez is a professor of political science and international relations at the University of San Diego. Her research interests include congressional elections, political parties, campaign finances, and the presidency. Dr. Dominguez teaching interests include a wide range of topics in American politics. Additionally, Dr. Dominguez serves as the faculty lead for the USD Votes Campaign, a nonpartisan, all-volunteer group of students, faculty, and staff dedicated to encouraging every eligible member of the USD community to exercise their right to vote. So once again, thank you, panelists.
Absolutely. That was a much better introduction. Thank you, Michelle, for doing that. The first two questions, we'll actually have about 6 questions. The first 2 questions, I'll go ahead and ask them. And I would ask that we go in alphabetical order, at least for those first 2 questions. So that would be Ms. Boland, then Ms. Covington, and then Dr. Dominguez. And really what I'm asking, the first question is, tell us a little bit about your personal and or professional experience surrounding voting. Oh, I think you're still muted, Ms. Boland.
I'm sorry, 18 months of teaching, virtually, and I still don't know how to unmute myself.
You're good.
Okay, so my name is Casey Boland, and I'm a teacher here at in Dallas, Texas. And I grew up in San Antonio, a middle-class white kid. I mean, my parents were educated. So my experience with voting is exactly what you think it'd be. I mean, I've been voting since I was 18, was very much current events and you can make a change in the world, very much a part of my life and my experience. And when I got to Lake Highlands is a Title I school, and I don't know if y'all know what that means, but we're incredibly diverse. We have over 50 languages that are spoken. Dallas is a refugee holding area in the United States. And so we have a lot of kids who are here because they're asylum seekers. We also have people who, live in multi-million-dollar mansions. We're about a third white, a third Black, third Hispanic, and I'm not a math teacher, but there's other people too. So, they're just sort of all over the place. And the thing that I would tell you about kids and their belief in voting is kids like me who grow up with money and who grow up with educated parents and who grow up white and privileged and all that kind of stuff. They vote when they're 18 and they, that kind of thing. My students of color, and as Michelle said, I teach 4 full African-American studies classes this year, and I have 4 white kids. Everybody else is a person of color. They do not believe that their voice matters. And you can tell them a lot about voting. You can, walk them and hold their hands to sign it and the cards and things like that. But the vision of they have a voice that can affect what happens in the world is, man, we got to work on that. So that's how I would answer that question. Sadly.
No, thank you so very much for sharing that. That voice piece is definitely kind of, you'll see that throughout the theme also in our slides, because that is an integral piece to all of this. Ms. Covington, if you don't mind telling us a little bit about your personal and or professional experience surrounding voting.
Sure. Thank you so much for the invitation to be here. So my background in the whole act of voting is a bit different in that I was brought up in a small country in West Africa by the name of Burkina Faso. And having been in a country that had been colonized by the French, we learned early in life about this whole matter of oppression and imperialism in the setting of our an infringement upon the rights of an individual. So at a young age, I was always vocal and engaged in wanting to know more in way of politics and who had the authority to make decisions about the people. But that being it not being necessarily a much democratic state because of it having been colonized, we did not have opportunity for votes on a consistent basis. They were almost scarce. They basically were not privy to those constituents that lived in that country. So when I had an opportunity, of course, having graduated there and come to the United States to go to college, I was introduced to this new opportunity, that is, that I can certainly cast my vote, share my voice, and it counts. And so I immediately, of course, got involved, just as I was involved in wanting to determine that my voice did matter where I was reared but never was heard. I took the opportunity and certainly saw this right as one that I could use. It has always been a daunting experience, a very fearful experience from such a younger age. Because of where I was reared, not really knowing if my vote mattered, but still having the opportunity to do so. It was always something that I always took a step back with and kind of made that decision, okay, this is the moment. It was always too much work, a little bit of anxiety around this whole aspect of being able to make a step forward and cast my vote. But nonetheless, I got very engaged in that process and learned earlier on that it was very important, just as I was equipping myself with information where I was reared, I had to do the same thing in order to understand the processes that took place here in the United States. And so for me, it's always been it's been an exercise that I had to plan and strategize and be prepared and not to have these anxieties and concerns about the validity of my presence in casting a vote, the strength in my voice that is shared through my vote. But of course, having matured and grown, I feel quite comfortable now. My concern in my fight and certainly the work, the space in which I really pursue in the way of activism is to ensure that there is no suppression of my vote and the vote of others. So that is in way of my personal experience. But in my professional, of course, as I stated, coming to the United States, it certainly gave me an opportunity to find myself in a more open and understanding environment, to be able to get more involved and to be able to discuss the matters at hand, to be informed and to find those areas that gave the information, and with that as well share the information. Of course, my role as a Black woman, it has always been one of really wanting to exercise not only my right to vote, but also to stay engaged and to be informed and to make sure they're informed, particularly as it pertains to Black and Brown communities. So that is, I guess, where I was raised in that experience has kind of propelled me and really to kind of lock in and to be more engaged in the aspect of really wanting to not just cast my vote, but to be engaged and to stay informed in all of these affairs to make sure that everyone is seen, everyone is heard.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. Both of you mentioned voice, and socioeconomic status was mentioned by Ms. Boland, and you're mentioning power dynamics. So a lot of that definitely has everything to do with how one feels and one experience with regards to voting. So Dr. Dominguez, if you don't mind also sharing with us personal and or professional experiences that you've had.
So, a lot of my personal and professional experiences relate to my work as a professor, right? So I spent my 20s studying voting behavior and how elections and campaigns work. And then I've spent the rest of my professional life, 16 years now, as a professor at USD, teaching young people about, why politics matters and how politics is a contest for power and how the rules shape who gets to participate in that contest and who's advantaged in that contest. And so one of the things that I've always done has been to create spaces for people to talk about politics. We had, back before the Zoom times, we had election parties, and we had, informational events for students to inform them about ballot initiatives. And we had things to make elections fun. But around 2014, there was a study that came out that showed that how few young people, how few college students were voting, particularly at USD. Our student voter turnout rate was only about 16%, which wasn't even up to the average for other colleges. And so at that point, I started the USD Votes campaign and took some of took the lessons from political science research about what makes it more and less likely for people to vote, and we have tried to apply that to the USD student community. And it's an affluent community, but it was still a community of people. Young people just don't vote. And there's a lot of really good reasons for that. Maybe we can talk about that later. But voting is one of the things. Voting is a really marginal activity, right? If it rains, less people vote. If lines are long, people aren't going to vote, right? It's an activity that people can be persuaded to do, and they can also be dissuaded from doing. And so our focus has been on making it easier for students to register and vote. We give them everything that they need. We try, as a volunteer organization, to give them everything they need to do that. And we've had a very good piece of good news this week in that we finally got the results of our 2020 Get Out the Vote campaign, where we got 76% of USD students to register and vote. And I'm like over the moon, super proud of that. And it really does show that voting is one of those things that can be made harder or made easier. And it takes an awful lot of labor to make it easier when there are rules that are set up to make it harder. Mm-hmm. And so we can talk more about that later, but that's my personal experience.
No, absolutely. Thank you for that. And actually, we can talk about that in the next piece, because the question is, from your perspective, in which ways have you seen voting suppressed in your state? You specifically mentioned reasons why young people don't vote. So if you can kind of allude to that in your responses as well. And again, it's from your perspective, in which ways have you seen voting suppressed in your state? Who is being affected the most, and how are they being affected? If you don't mind sharing that a little bit, Ms. Boland.
I'm in Texas, so you're asking me to narrow this down. So, my God, there's so much happening in the last couple of years here in Texas that just overtly screams, we don't want certain people to vote. And in Texas, it's not just minorities. It's, if you're a Democrat, we don't want you to vote. We want to make sure it's as hard as possible. But I would say the biggest deterrent to any kid is not the kids that I work with. It's not just that they don't hear their voices heard. They don't feel like anybody who has any sort of power is going to do anything to help them. And it's starting not going to help you. It's starting to feel more like we are actively going to try to harm you with, the CRT thing. I teach ethnic studies. That is a direct hit on my students and what they learn about themselves and things like that. And so I know that it doesn't seem like the CRT thing has anything to do with voting, but it absolutely does. We have school boards here in Texas that, South Lake is just right up there. It's not far from where Michelle and I are. And all of these culture wars that are feeding into school district and school district elections, they are absolutely affecting schools. And that's just on the very, very local level. that I can explain to you about that. And kids are, even though that's in the minutia, they're starting to see it. I mean, because they see things on TV that say, "Oh no, you don't talk about racism. Don't talk about that. That is racist." And they see that the things that matter to them, politicians are saying, you can't even talk about it. I mean, we now have the list of books that our governor wants to ban. I mean, we're flying back into a whole lot of really terrible U.S. history here, and kids see it. And then, but I can also tell you to give you a little bit of happy news. I mean, those kids are 18, and you do actually like give them the thing and say, "Here, sign up," and they realize that they can vote. And then they do it, and they like run into the room, and they show you their little sticker, and they're all excited. So it is possible to make them understand that they have a way to make a difference. But man, that hill's getting steeper. So there you go.
I definitely can understand that. So there's the banning of books that you mentioned, the culture war. The line I'm going to take from you, honestly, is talking about racism is racist. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for sharing that. I mean, I laugh, but that's just kind of my reaction to a lot of things, because if you don't laugh, then I'm just sitting here all day. So, and Mario also shared, his thoughts in the chat, mentioning that, we also have an archaic system. So that's definitely a barrier to voting as well. So Ms. Covington, Tembilla, if you don't mind kind of sharing a little bit about, from your perspective, what have been some of those barriers, and what has suppressed some of the vote in your community?
Well, I think you all shared that information in your video that you at the beginning of this seance, is that, our former governor, Pat McCrory, certainly brought a Jim Crow 2.0 era during his term. Fortunately, with Governor Cooper, there have been some rollbacks of those bills in order to ensure that there are voting sites available, and not far from the marginalized, the impoverished communities, which are respectively generally the Black and Brown communities. And it may not seem like it is an important matter, that they may be a few miles away, but when transportation is the number one issue to those communities, it matters. And also timelines as to how long the polls are open, how many polls can be provided, can be open during times when those communities are available. As a faith leader here in Winston-Salem, Forsyth County, it's been quite important for us to kind of equip ourselves with allies and to collaborate. And so I am the president of the Ministers Conference of Winston-Salem and Vicinity, which is a collaborative of church pastors, clergy, lay members, all together for the cause around social justice, and certainly trying to resolve some of the most relevant and current issues of our community and finding solutions. But we collaborate and we work mostly with the Winston-Salem NAACP chapter. We also collaborate with the Winston-Salem Urban League. And that is a force to be reckoned when you have three civil rights organizations come together and work at organizing, first mobilizing the communities by engaging them, informing them of some of the things that they need to be prepared for, which is voter registration. What are the timelines? Where are the poll sites? How can they get there? Not only how can they get there, but how can we work together to provide that transportation for them? When we get them there, how do we get them back home? Ensuring that there's certainly enough time for those that want to submit absentee ballots, and understanding those guidelines. That has also been, those have been a challenge as well in North Carolina. And they're trying to change that, they're trying to change the status where absentee ballot now has a lesser time frame of being able to submit them. And so there are so many different things around voter suppression that perhaps may not make it seem difficult or challenging to affluent communities. But to the communities that I serve and that I work with, even in a secular environment, they are very specific concerns. And as detailed in your video, Pat McCrory, it was with surgical precision that he certainly drafted, and put into law guidelines around how we could actually vote, voter ID necessary, which is of course not what we have to have now, but these are things that are set in place particularly and precisely to certainly minimize the opportunities for the less privileged, the disenfranchised communities to be able to cast their vote. And of course, providing information, places where information can be provided, it certainly is a factor in suppressing the vote of an individual. So for the communities that I work with, certainly there are so many different ways that with surgical precision, the lawmakers put into place Senate bills that really exclude those voices that are the ones that generally politicians do seek after for their vote. And that is just by those mere things, not giving them opportunity to get to the polls, not making it easy to cast their vote, and certainly taking away any type of funding around programs and projects that can support mobilizing and organizing communities of color to cast their vote. So there are so many different things that are placed and put into law that certainly challenge the vote of individuals and residents here in Winston-Salem, Forsyth County, and North Carolina overall. And we look at all these legislations, with a fine-tooth comb, because in them there are these particular guidelines that suppress the vote of the marginalized, the impoverished, and unfortunately, they resemble people like me, the Black and brown people.
No, absolutely. And I honestly have to say, I love that you kind of offered a solution in your discussion by talking about that collaboration to mobilize. So thank you for sharing that. And Dr. Dominguez, if you don't mind giving us a little bit of.
Yeah, the question you asked was about the way that voting is suppressed within my state. And I'd actually like to say some nice things about voting law changes that are happening in some places in the country. There's a whole bunch of states that are actually working really hard to make it easy to vote. And in those places, we see very high rates of voter turnout. And that is across the board, and it includes marginalized communities. Minnesota traditionally, for the last quarter century, led the nation in voting because they have same-day voter registration, which means you don't have to register in advance, which is how lots of other countries do it, right? Other democracies, there's no voter registration. The government knows who you are and where you are. They can find you if they need you. And so they don't put it on the burden of the individual to register affirmatively to vote. And so there's a whole bunch of states that are now offering same-day voter registration, which we're now doing in California. So you can register to vote on election day if you've forgotten to do it beforehand. California is also moving to vote by mail, which is another innovation that a bunch of states have used. Oregon's been doing vote by mail, Utah, Washington State, I think, Colorado's been doing vote by mail, and vote. It's just easier, right? You don't have to vote on election day. You get it in your mailbox. It's not a panacea. It doesn't work for everybody. Native American communities aren't always advantaged by vote by mail, but for a lot of people, it makes it easier than having to risk having a long line on election day, or not being able to find childcare, or all of the things that keep a person away from the polls on election day. And so in combination, there are a lot of states that are making voting easier in a lot of different ways. And I think we should be excited about that. But I think that also points to exactly what Ms. Covington was talking about, which is that there are a lot of ways to make voting harder. You can make it harder to register. You can say you have to register 30 days in advance instead of 27 or 14 or 10. You can say that if you want to vote by mail, you have to send in a separate requirement. I deal with voter registration laws from all over the country because we have students from all of the 50 states. And you have to, so for students to register to vote, first they have to register, and then they have to, in many states, request an absentee ballot. Sometimes those absentee ballots have to be notarized. Sometimes you have to submit an ID along with that, or a specific state issued form of ID. So they can make the polls close at 7 instead of 8. They can make the polls only open for 3 days of early voting instead of 2 weeks of early voting. There's a ton of ways that by state policies, states can make it harder for people to vote. And of course, one thing we know is that people who have the highest levels of education and the higher levels of income have both all the resources they need to figure out, to get there, to make that 30-day deadline and to find a notary and do all the things that you would need to do to vote. And as people's lives are harder and more complicated and people are more marginalized, that's who's going to be dissuaded from voting when you make it voting harder. And so what's been so horrific since the Shelby County versus Holder decision has been the real innovation that some states have brought to the project of making it harder to vote through public policy, looking for really creative ways to make it harder on working people. So that's, I think it's hard to identify just one way that voter suppression takes place, because really a lot of ways that it can take place. And there are also a lot of ways to make voting accessible and easier.
And Dr. Dominguez, you brought up a good point. I think it's one of these to where depends on where you live, the state in which you live in, where they strategically put restrictions in place, as we discussed before, to decide who and who cannot vote. And so I think that is why, and I think Ms. Covington was saying this in Casey Boland, is we have to get people informed of the laws that are out there, that are trying to restrict or suppress your right to vote. And so that kind of brings me to the next question. I'm kind of going a little bit off the cuff, but how and anyone can answer this question, how do you think what's a better way for us to get out that information to people about either potential voting restrictions that are going on in your state, or just informed about politics and the candidates? I mean, I work with my sorority in getting people to vote and getting, knocking on doors. And it's very surprising to me when people are not informed even about the topics. For example, in Texas, we had a vote on our Constitution, some constitutional changes. And it was amazing how people in my community had no idea what was on the ballot. So in your opinion, because we're really trying to change things, we're change makers. We're trying to really get people informed about their right to vote. So how are ways that we can better inform the community? And anyone can take the question.
Well, I'll go ahead and start if that's okay. So I'll just kind of share in way of what we do here in Forsyth County. Again, it goes back to having some good allies, some partners, because this is not a one woman show or one man show where we can really try to mobilize and to share this information. And it requires a lot of grassroots efforts, boots on the ground, particularly, again, I could only speak to the communities that I serve, and those are the marginalized, impoverished communities that whose resources are limited. And so the work that we do is a lot of mobilizing around grassroots, community events to share more about the upcoming elections, also having some candidate forums. I think it's important that candidate forums are strategically scheduled and planned in order for the communities to be able to know more about the candidates, the political candidates, and what their plans and their visions are, but also holding them accountable to keep people engaged, just to ensure that even after election, that there is a continual effort to keep citizens engaged with the progress of our elected officials. Because where I see it and where we are today, and I'll just reserve to speak for the area in which I am, we need to get some candidates with some much better visions that really address the concerns of the majority and not just themselves. There needs to be a plan in place, and we need to be able to share that. And so we typically do that through a grassroots efforts, and that is to do the canvassing, the knocking on doors, having community events, bringing some of the candidates to those community events to speak to the residents. And then, of course, having our candidate forums on a regular basis and continually staying engaged with the residents here through providing some updates and creating some progress reports that we can begin to discuss the progress made based on the vision that they set out to do. And so that there's always this information that is shared and reminding them that the impact of their vote matters, and that when we know more, of course, it continues to kind of resurge this energy to want to stay engaged and to be, to certainly want to make sure that we get who we want to do the job for us. So those are some of the efforts that we do in our community.
Go ahead, Casey. No, go ahead, Casey.
I feel like I can sort of speak for just the high school vote, which is astounding because I'm not in high school at all. But it's not just getting information out there. It's having to like deprogram the bad information first. And the other part of that is the people who are disingenuous and giving intentionally bad information, they are mobilized, they have money, and they have consistent, super simple messages. And these kids hear it everywhere. And if you're going to get them, I can tell you where to go. Have a bunch of really famous people make a bunch of TikToks, and every kid in the world will see it 30 times a day. But it's not just that information. It's getting rid of the other stuff. And I can tell you in schools, we try to do stuff like, I do it all the time, just trying to make kids understand what is a real source and what isn't. And that is getting even, I've been doing this forever, and that is getting even harder for me to understand who's a bot and who's not. They're getting incredibly sophisticated. And I'd say probably in the last 10 years, and Dr. Dominguez is nodding her head. So it's getting incredibly difficult to tell the bad actors because there's so many of them, but they do have a very, very consistent message, and kids hear it all the time. And that's part of this that has to be, it's not only the true stuff that has to come out, but it has to be louder, and it has to be more consistent, and it has to be more understandable than what they're already hearing. So.
I'll just echo, I'll echo that also. And yeah, I'm nodding. I completely agree. Yes, the misinformation is as big a problem now as the general we all are busy at the end of the day. We want to turn on the TV. We want to watch something entertaining. Nobody wants to watch the NewsHour and, read, like, we don't want to turn on our, we can now, right? We can all like log into the city council meeting and watch it for 4 hours on a Tuesday, but nobody wants to do that. Right? Not even us. And we really care.
Yeah.
And like, one of the things that we're really losing right now is local journalism.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah.
The best things that we can do is support local journalism and encourage the kind of fact-based local community information sources in our own communities, that and encourage those organizations to also be like a little hip, that if you're going to have a local newspaper, you ought to have a Snapchat account too.
Mm-hmm.
And that those are specialized skills, and that's they don't have any money either.
Mm-hmm.
And so all of that is wrapped up into how hard it is to inform people. But we're not going to do it ourselves. Each of us is not going to sit down and watch every city council meeting. And we rely on those intermediaries to do that for us. And Facebook is not a good one. That is not a good place for that information to be coming from. So we need responsible intermediaries, community groups, church groups, local newspapers, citizens groups, high schools, colleges to try to help like put together the information that people need about their communities. And so deep community roots and journalism, I think, are an essential part of that picture, but it's hard. There's no money there.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I really appreciate the conversation about the information that's going out there, not only to our young adults, but even just regular people, right? And unfortunately, we are, I hate to use the word, but we are kind of trapped into Facebook and Twitter about getting our information. And if we've learned anything from the last couple of elections, is how these various forms of information is not always on the side of democracy, right?
Right.
Everyone has their own agenda when it comes to whose narrative, whose voice is being told and heard for the advantage of not the many, but we're saying the few. Mm-hmm. And so in saying this, as we wrap up our discussion, if you could just summarize for us how you see voting, and maybe where we need to focus more of our efforts in our struggle and in our fight to get more people engaged in their right to vote. Casey?
Well, I am forever and always going to say kids, but I'm right. Because especially in like communities of refugees and people like that, a lot of times it's the kids who know how to speak English. So the kids go back home and they help their parents to understand things that are going on. Communities that are really tight, if kids learn things and talk about things and they go back and they tell their parents and things like that, that's a fabulous way to get people to buy into how they can change communities. And also, I know I've said some really negative things, and I know a lot of it's true. And however, do not underestimate this generation. Man, they are passionate and they care and they are trying to do a good job. It's just like everybody else, sometimes they just get a little discouraged and stuff, but put your money on this generation. I mean, kids are gonna, if we give them the tools and we give them the support, they can really, really make a difference, and they will. That seems pretty Pollyanna of me, but I'm not wrong. I mean, they will be here for us if we back them.
Ms. Covington?
Yes, so I will second that motion. Our young people certainly are our future. but I would curtail that with ensuring that we provide them with truth and transparency.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
I think that is absolutely essential. As I mentioned earlier, where we are in this day and age, I'm concerned of the of those that come forward with visions of their own to better communities. And what we're finding out is, you know, they are self-guided and certainly not they're not for the community at large. But our young people, certainly, they deserve in this day and age to be seen, and they deserve to be heard. And the best way to really engage them and to nurture a truth-telling and strong relationship is to provide truth and transparency. They have endured a lot more than we could even speak to in so many different ways. We all have our stories of challenges in life, but these young people have gone through and some experiences that we are not equipped to assist them with. But if we can use our truth and transparency to and share that and impart that into them, I truly believe that they are going to be stronger, and they're going to be wiser about how to handle the future.
Thank you. And Dr. Dominguez.
Yeah, I think that I work with young people too, and I would say that the solution, there are many. We're political scientists have taken to drinking over the last several years. Like, it is democracy. The future of democracy in this country is tenuous. It's a hard road right now, and one of the places where we can strengthen democracy is by helping young people understand what it means to live in a democracy. And frankly, from a public policy perspective, that's not like a semester of government in high school, like one unit in 8th grade and a semester in your senior year on the way out the door. That is not enough civics. That is not enough understanding. That's not living a democratic life. Most people don't go to college. So high school is really where it's at, I think, in terms of teaching people how to be tolerant, how to be engaged, how to inform themselves, how to understand their history and how to understand how the government works, how to understand their fellow citizens. I think high schools need to do a lot better supporting democracy, and of course it's hard because they're under state laws right now that are making it harder for them to teach to create democratic citizens. So in the meantime, I think it's community groups that have to step up and step into the void and bring people to the polls and bring people into the political system, especially in places where the state is making it hard to be an engaged person.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing. If somebody was keeping track and was like, Raketa said 6 questions, and this has not been 6 questions, just ignore that little piece of information right there. But I really want to also offer this up to the audience if they have some questions. Part of it is because there's been a few of you kind of involved and engaged in posting some things. I know that Abel and Mario, specifically around social media and things like that, when you all shared that information, they were very much typing their thoughts down there. But if anyone has any questions at this time for our panelists, we'd love for you to unmute and just kind of ask that question. And then we'll go ahead and transition to our next activity.
I have one question. So Dr. Dominguez, I think you said that within a matter of a couple of years, it went from 16% to 70-something% of students or the community at USD. Like, first of all, like that's a success story in and of itself. But what's a lesson from that process that you learned that could be applicable, outside the confines of USD for others who are involved in this work? Is there one thing that comes up that was surprising or is could be a takeaway?
Yeah, the lesson from colleges that are doing a really good job with this, and there are some that are doing even better, is it's so time intensive. It's one-on-one. You have to take the time to speak to each person and explain to them, show them the form, help them understand that it's a two-step process. First, you need to register, and then you need to get your ballot. And then you have to remind them when the day, you don't want to mail it on election day. Don't do that. In a lot of states, you have to mail it 2 weeks early, right? So you have to know all the information and you have to talk to every person. And it's just so labor intensive. But having a short conversation with a person will get them to vote. So, it's definitely worth the time, but it takes manpower and time.
Thank you, Tommy, for sharing that. If there are no other questions, thank you so very much, panelists, for being here, for sharing. Please stay if you don't mind. We do have some kind of following activities and things like that. Unless there are any last thoughts that any of you want to share, we'll go ahead and transition to our next activity.
Okay, thank you, Raketa. So now that we have had our conversation, beginning our conversation on voting rights experiences and what we need to do as a community to inform and engage others, we're going to have a breakout session where we want to get your personal perspectives. So during this breakout session, please share an aha experience from listening to our panelists today. What has been your experience when it comes to voting? And then also, what are you currently doing in your workplace or in your community? Or what are you going to do? So from our conversations, once again, it's this taking action. And so Raketa will now kind of explain the directions for our breakout session, and then Mario will do our discussion norms.
Absolutely. So it's just like Michelle said, it is kind of answering those 3 questions, but we're using Jamboard. So if you've never used Jamboard before, it's fairly easy. The first slide actually just has the instructions, as you can see right here. And it's just this idea of you move to the next slide. It should be at the top. It'll show 1 through 6. You just click the arrow to move to the next slide, number 2. And number 2 has that first question that Michelle went ahead and mentioned, that aha moment. And then number 3 has the second question, and slide number 4 has the third question. There are already Post-its of sorts, digital Post-its on each of the slides. So just pick one. You do not have to write your name. We just want to capture everyone's voice, because one thing we learned with all of these BLM series and activities is that, we glean ideas from a lot of our audiences. And so we want to capture a lot of the things that you say and reflect on as a result of that. So the Jamboard link is actually already posted in the chat. And once you go into your breakout section, you can click on that. I would actually suggest you click on it now so that you can have it available and have the discussion around those 3 questions. I hope that made sense.
In the discussion, I just want to name that, we're all processing a lot of wonderful information that's been shared, plus our own lived experiences and positionality within voting and what it's meant to us. So I hope these norms can support a good discussion. 1, listen with intentionality and be okay with awkward silences, especially in a space where we haven't really coexisted or met each other for the first time. We always want you to speak your truth and share authentically. Always use I statements as you're referencing comments. Respect confidentiality of the spaces. We will too. Lean into discomfort. A lot of times in these spaces, comfort is always put over justice. And so from our experience, we want to always put justice over comfort in a lot of these talks as we're growing our critical consciousness. Be mindful of the time so everyone gets to share, especially with like the small groups that we have. Recognize that this is unfinished work. We're definitely not going to solve all the issues of voting in this time frame, but hopefully there is some inspiration of where to go next. Recognize your communication style, and lastly, examine your own assumptions and perceptions. I always think of intent versus impact, right? Like it's okay to lean into curiosity of why or what somebody said, rather than us create definitions of them for ourselves. So hopefully that could be helpful to you all in this discussion. So thanks.
Great. So I'm going to be moving you all into the breakout rooms. We'll have about 20 minutes, and then we'll come back to get some amazing conversations going on.
There's actually a really amazing question that Dr. Lathan went ahead and asked.
Yeah, he did.
In a smaller group setting.
Yeah, he did. All right. So
so it looks like we had 3 groups share. So we'll go through like each room if there's a representative. We'll start out with just highlights, any themes that folks discussed that were brought up. So we'll start with room 1. So Abel, Casey, Dr. Lathan, Kaylee, Raketa.
So Dr. Lathan shared a really great question in the small group. If you don't mind sharing that question one more time, that would be great.
Very well, very well. I was very interested when I heard that Casey is teaching the inaugural African American Studies class that they have at her school. And I was curious of the experience and response of the student, being that she's teaching in such a diverse environment. What is the response that the students have when they first find out that she is the teacher of this course, and how do they respond to that? So I'm gonna let her respond to it to be able to share exactly, but I learned something that I'm glad that I asked, and I'm glad she shared.
Yeah, they were like, yeah, you're white. Do you know how to teach us history? Okay. I mean, adults cared. Kids did not care. They did not care at all. And so, I mean, and I use it, so, but yeah, kids want you to show up. They want you to care. They want you to be there for them. I'm white, and I'm from Texas, but I'm telling you right now, if I had to teach Texas history, I 1000% would not be the best person for the job. I know where the Alamo is.
I would have to interject here because I know Casey and she's downplaying. Casey has a voice and she is their champion. There's been a lot of things going on at her school. And if there's anyone that's fighting for the students at Lake Highlands High School, the students of color, it's Casey Boland. She is out there talking about the importance of critical race theory. She is out there talking about why students are feeling the way that they do at that school and why the teachers and administrators at that school need to listen. She is out there advocating, and she is out there protesting with the kids at her school. And I can tell you the reason why the kids are saying that is because they see what she does. They see what she does. Her actions and her words match. And those of you who know me, I would not be saying this if it wasn't true. Casey is out there fighting for justice and equity for those students. And I wish I was back at that school because I would be right there by her, with my picket sign saying all those things that you say on Facebook and have no fear of your job being taken away, I would be right there with you. So I appreciate everything that you do for those kids. I'm sorry, I'm off my soapbox.
Oh, thank you for sharing. I appreciate that. I think consciousness is big. I mean, Casey, you're displaying what critical consciousness means if all of us are fighting for the same fight. So yes, I agree with all that.
Yeah. But can I also add that it takes people of different colors, different race, different genders to make real change, because that's how change has been made. It doesn't happen from just one person. A lot of the civil rights movement would have never happened if there hadn't been white people working alongside Black people, because they're the ones that had access. They're the ones that had the voice, but they had the sympathy and the human heart to be able to really see the need of a person, regardless of the color, to advocate for them. So if there are not other people fighting for a cause, there is a problem, because that's why it makes it so hard to change if it's just one person or one color or one gender. So I appreciate the work that so many people that are not of the same ethnicity, the work that they do, it really helps that work move forward. So that's why I really appreciate it.
And I mean, my God, people of color have got to be exhausted. I mean, y'all have been carrying this water for so long. And, you know, people who look like me need to stand up there, because the truth is, Michelle, I am way more protected than most people. And I finally know that. And it's because I know what I'm doing. I've proven myself, stuff like that. But also I'm not wrong. You know, I mean, that's another thing. But yeah, I mean, I understand, but that is the thing that I see different now, is that there are more people who are not people of color who are saying, you know what, this is a human rights thing at this point, you know, and always has been, but, you know, but thank you very much for your kind words, Michelle. That was very nice.
For time constraint purposes, I think we can continue this, but I kind of like this mic drop element to this discussion as well. I don't know if room 2 or room 4 want to add anything to this before we close out. Everybody good? Thank you all for sharing. I really appreciate that. Let me just share. Let's see this. One thing I wanted to just highlight, I love Revisionist History by Malcolm Gladwell. I don't know if you've heard this episode, but they had Democracy in Practice come and present on the show. I'm going to show a little video clip, but it's basically how do we rethink how democracy works within the school system, right? Because there's an archetype of kid that always gets to be elected: popularity, saying the right things, performative versus action-oriented, pizza at lunch all the time, like things like that, right? So I really like this perspective, so I wanted to just share this little video with you all.
Mario, we can't hear the video.
Since 2014.
Sorry about that.
Since 2014, we've been working in Bolivia with students that have moved away from the traditional model of student government and are experimenting with some really innovative forms of democracy. So they no longer hold student elections. Instead, they randomly select their representatives. It's similar to how people are selected to form citizens' juries and citizens' assemblies. They also no longer have the same student representatives for the whole school year. And instead they take turns rotating in and out of student government. And they no longer have those traditional roles like president and vice president, and instead are experimenting with different ways to work horizontally. So these aren't your typical student governments, and the changes that they've been testing out have shown some real advantages. Random selection makes student governments more inclusive. It opens the door for shyer and less popular students to fully participate, because they no longer have to form a political party, run a campaign, and win an election competing against students who are more charismatic and outgoing. And opening the door to all types of students also makes the student governments themselves more diverse and more representative of the student body as a whole. Rotation allows more students to participate, and working together horizontally, it not only increases teamwork, but it also spreads learning opportunities more equitably. Every member of the student government has to learn to set an agenda, facilitate a meeting, speak in front of the entire school, instead of focusing these learning opportunities on just a few individuals, like a class president and vice president. So we start by experimenting with a structure that is more inclusive, participative, it's more equitable. And then we as advisors provide tools and capacity building to help student governments work effectively on issues that they identify and that they want to address. So instead of student government being characterized by exclusion and disengagement, we're turning it into a rich learning opportunity that's open to everyone. And the experimentation that's going on is collaborative. The students create their own rules and they put forth their own ideas for how to improve the design. So we're not only developing engaged and effective citizens, but we're also teaching young people to think critically and creatively about democracy and ways that it could be improved.
So Mario, I think your video is basically wrapped up what we've been trying to say and what we've discussed, right? If we want the future to be engaged in politics and voting, we've got to get them involved. We've got to show them, we've got to reimagine a different way of democracy, how democracy looks to them and how they can gain their power and their voice within the system. So Mario, if you wouldn't mind the next. So we just wanted to give you a couple of resources. We have books on voting for kids and youth. We also have youth voting right groups and ways to engage groups. We also have more information on our Voting Rights Act information, John Lewis Voting Rights Act, and also For the People Act, once again, just so you can be informed. And then also we shared our lived experiences. So we also wanted to give you a little bit more lived experiences through Fannie Lou Hamer and our Native American brothers and sisters in their voting rights experience. So next slide. So we would like to, for our closing, we are introducing Dr. Reyes Quezada. He is the professor and chair of Department of Learning and Teaching. Dr. Quezada writes and teaches in areas of bilingual education, K-12 teacher recruitment, issues on faculty of color, instructional models, home and school community partnerships. He came to USD in 1999 from the University of Redlands, and prior to that, he taught at California State University. He has also lectured for California State University in San Bernardino, San Diego State University, and the Washington Center for Academic Seminars in Washington, D.C. So if you would please welcome Dr. Quezada.
Thank you. Thank you. This is a great opportunity to get a chance to hear everyone. So first of all, I just want to, on behalf of the department, thank Dr. Jazz and the this particular group that provided the guidance. Michelle, Tommy, Mario, Raketa, thank you for your service, and again the other BLM committee members that participate in other months' activities. I really want to thank the panelists, Casey and Tembilla and Mr. Dr. Dominguez for providing your words. I wrote all kinds of stuff. As I told my students, I wrote an article just based on the conversation today, but I think because of time I want to skip some of the information. But I think what I got out of it were three basic themes. Obviously, the issue in terms of the barriers that have been placed amongst us with regards to voting from early on, as a result, obviously, of the Voting Rights Act that countered those narratives. So a lot of the barriers that were said before are now starting to evolve, as was mentioned, in terms of the 48 different states and all the different bills that are out there. So I think my message is that we need to keep vigilant with regards to the barriers that are always being placed, and that by being vigilant, we're hopefully able to then do the counter narratives with regards to whatever things state legislatures, depending who's in power. In our small group, we were talking about, is there really a difference whether there's a Democrat or Republican in terms of who's in power? And I think in certain situations there is, because I could tell you there's a big difference between having, or at least depending where you follow your perspective, having Donald Trump as president than having George Bush or his father, Mr. Bush, as president. Obviously, I'm sure there's policies that we didn't agree with the Bush family, but a big difference in terms of them or Ronald Reagan or some of the other Republicans. So I think being vigilant and being able to stay in line is a great way. The other things that came out were the neat things about opportunities. Casey, you're doing it with regards to working with the youth, and I think Casey yourself, obviously with the results of USD's voting numbers that have increased from 20 to 70%, regardless, again, in terms of the population. I mean, the hope is that we could replicate what you did here in other communities of color, with a hope that, it would also raise the voting there as well. So I think there's a lot of opportunities that we can learn from each other and move in that direction. And I think the other third one is again this innovations to counter the barriers. So there are a lot of states, there are a lot of communities that are making a big difference. I mean, if we look in terms of, if you've read Barack Obama's book, in terms of his way into the presidency was through his own community organization, in terms of really working with communities in Chicago and really, getting up there and, long shot, and look what happened. But it was because of the innovations that he created among his own parties. In California, there is a big difference between having the Democratic controlled legislature versus a Republican, regardless of which line you're in, because you can tell a big difference in terms of the bills that have been signed by the governor. It was mentioned to Mari that tomorrow morning I'm meeting with James Ramos, who's the only Native American assemblyman in California after so many years. But he's introduced 8 different bills that the governor has already signed with regards to issues of Native American initiatives. So it does make a difference than when Pete Wilson was in power, or Ronald Reagan, or some of the others. So again, I think the innovations is a great way to coalesce, work with students, work with communities, and making that difference. And again, raising the numbers in terms of in terms of the voting. It was interesting in terms as Casey was speaking, Dr. Dominguez, right away I reflected on my own experiences in terms of how did I come about voting. I was born in Mexico, so I actually didn't become a citizen until I was maybe 25, and I came at the age of 7. So I didn't vote during that time. But my wife ran for school board, and the previous school board, the other school board member lost by 1 vote. So that was the impetus for me to say, you know what, I'm going to be a dual citizen. I'm going to go ahead and vote, and got involved. Got involved with community organization where we made a difference in Imperial County in terms of turning, all the majority were maybe Latinos in terms of the county. The majority of all the boards were not Latino, and within a 10-year period, through the community organization, we made a difference. So I think the community organization does have a big, could have a big impact in terms of what we do with our students. Again, the issue of voice, the socioeconomic status, and obviously the political or politics in terms of the institutions of power does make a difference in terms of voter suppression. I think as you know, the title of the session in terms of race is political, and I think all of you have read Paulo Freire. Teaching is political. So what Casey you're doing, and Michelle, is you're right in there. You're making teaching as a form of making a difference with the students that you're working with in terms of that area. Again, other just great things that were brought up. I think Dr. Covington, you brought about the transportation, bringing polls, providing translation services, and those were again some of the similar things that I was involved in my early years with the American Citizens Club in Brawley, where we provided transportation, we translated, we went and picked up people, and all of a sudden we turned the school board from 4-1 Anglo to 4-1 Latinos. In community college board, we did the same thing. So again, I think there are ways of getting out there and making a difference within your community. Yeah, so I think those would be the key things, and I enjoyed the conversation at the end in terms of ending on the solutions. Great case that you mentioned that do not underestimate the this generation. I think we have hope on them, and I think we're the ones that can make the changes. And what the topic on again, as long as we're truth and that we provide transparency is also important. And again, the big thing in terms of the role of schools and what can we do whether it's a high school, elementary, or at the university. I think we can also provide that guidance for our students. So thank you very much. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you, Dr. Quezada. So we just have one more slide, and that is actually an invite that, just like with voting, this work needs to come from a grassroots movement. It needs to come from the community. And so this series is actually created and sustained by our community. And Raketa put in the chat the link to this form. On December 15th from 4 to 6, we are going to have our planning session. So we'll be identifying topics for our spring series, our speakers, what activities, what style of presentation we'll have. And we'll definitely have it on Zoom, but we may have an in-person group. So it might be a hybrid planning meeting, but we would really love for you to be a part of that so that we can continue to bring important messages and ideas and resources to our community here at USD. So on behalf of the DLT Black Lives Matter Social Justice and Advocacy Series planning team, I want to thank you all for being here this evening. And I almost think we should put 4:30-ish, knowing that we often go over. But I just want to say thank you all and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.